we'll do the live thing first. Like, hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. It's me, your host, Bigmark. Nice to have you here, me and you again, as always. If it's your first time here, or if you're a long time listener and you want to support the podcast, go check out our Patreon at patreon.com/thebigmarkpod. And then don't forget to like this video if you're watching on YouTube. And if you're listening, go rate the podcast and give a review if you'd like to. But yeah, today, you know, as we do, I'm gonna go through a little thing one-on-one with you, and we're gonna talk about this awesome documentary that I saw called Tim's Vermeer. And I implore everyone listening to go check that out. But one of the coolest things I've seen in a long time, the documentary is actually from 2013, and I briefly mentioned it in our last podcast, actually, with Scott Mallon. Shout out Scott Mallon. That was an awesome episode. I briefly mentioned this documentary that I saw that Andrew Santino, shout out Cheeto Santino, on his podcast mentioned about this documentary, and he said it was phenomenal. And it's, like I said, it's called Tim's Vermeer, and it was actually directed by Teller of Penn and Teller fame, so the same, like those magicians. The Tim in the story of Tim's Vermeer, his name's Tim Jennison. He's actually friends with Penn Jillette, and then so Penn has known this guy forever. Like, they went up in like one of those anti-gravity planes, like, you know, the ones that the astronauts go into, and you know, they watched eclipses. They actually watched like the last eclipse, so not like the most recent one in 2017 or whatever, but like whatever, 30 years ago. I think every eclipse is like that long. Anyway, so I did like the last one, so I think that was 2017. Christian's just asking if I had seen the last eclipse, and it's funny you should ask, actually. When was that last one?
It was 2018.
2018, right? I think it was too. Yeah. So it's funny because obviously with an eclipse, as everyone knows, because most of you have lived through this, you can't look straight at it because obviously you're basically looking straight at the sun, and you can like burn your retina really easily. Your eye just can't handle that much intensity, and basically the moon going in front of the sun actually intensifies that ring of light, right? So anyway, when you observe it, like, how did you actually watch the eclipse? Did you actually see it?
Oh yeah, I did.
Did you use one of those, like, did you have like those goggles, or did you use one of those little box things?
Little box things.
Yeah.
Yeah, man.
So that's called a camera obscura.
Yeah. So it doesn't mess your eyes up, but you can still look through the mirror. Right?
100%, right? So you can actually see an accurate representation of the eclipse without having to look directly at it. Because basically what a camera obscura is, and we'll get into why this is relevant in a second, but basically what a camera obscura is I'm pretty sure camera obscura is Latin for light box. Anyway, I don't even know. Do you want to search up real quick for me, CPUP? I got CPUP behind the scenes as always.
Yo.
Hey. But basically, so a camera obscura is essentially any size box. It could be the size of a shoebox, it could be the size of a room that's dark inside. And essentially there's a hole in one of the sides of the boxes, and any image outside the box that's in light can actually be projected through the small hole in the box to the opposite side in the box. The light will go through there and basically be projected on the other end of the box upside down and backwards. So essentially it's almost how your eye works.
You can make one even with like a cereal box. Really.
Yeah, 100%. You can use a shoebox. What's it in Latin? Did you see anywhere? The translation. But yeah, so essentially, that's how we were able to see the eclipse.
Its meaning is dark chamber.
Dark chamber, exactly. So I was totally off with the light, but camera obscura means dark chamber. So again, with the dark box and inside, and basically you can use this setup to view any object. And it was kind of in early optics when people were figuring this out back in the day. They were basically just figuring out that you can actually do this whole process, and it's kind of a cool trick of optics. It basically works, the light works in a wave or a particle, but as a wave, it's basically concentrated through this little hole, and then it's shot over. So you can use this process, and you can put a lens in that little hole, and you can sharpen and focus the image.
It kind of like correlates to how the eye works in a sense.
Right. So that's basically exactly how the eye works. So your eyeball, the image that you actually see in your eye. So you obviously have your eyeball at the front of it, is your pupil, obviously, which is the hole. Imagine the hole in the box of the camera obscura. Your pupil is that hole, and your iris and the muscles around it can close and open that hole and basically change the amount of light that's coming in, and the light goes through your eye, and it is projected on the back of your eyeball, which is where your retina is. But when it's actually projected backwards and upside down, but your brain actually flips the image. So what we're actually seeing when you're looking at reality is flipped upside down.
Yeah, basically we're upside down.
Right. But our body and coordination and everything works together to navigate this reality, which is really interesting.
Perfect. It's crazy.
Anyway, I'll tell you in a sec why that was perfect segue. So Tim's Vermeer, again, is a documentary that basically covers one man, Tim Jennison's voyage into finding out how Johannes Vermeer used to paint his paintings. So again, the Vermeer that we are talking about is Johannes Vermeer. He was a Dutch Baroque master. He was considered one of the master painters. He's born in 1632 in Delft in the Netherlands. He was considered one of the best painters of all time, and he was the son of an art dealer in Delft, and he was really, really well known. His paintings were beautiful. They seemed to glow on canvas, and they kind of seemed more like an image on a movie screen rather than someone actually painting it. At the time, Dutch artists, so during the 1600s, Dutch artists commonly learned by apprenticeship. Someone had taught them. They went to schools. They kept written records of all their training. And the weirdest thing about Vermeer is that none of these papers have ever been found. So it's like he was never taught. It's like he's some kind of savant and it's as if he could just go up to the canvas and just start painting, because a lot of art historians have actually x-rayed some of his paintings, and there weren't any like sketches underneath the paint. Like any artist, usually an artist would use a pencil or charcoal or something and sketch out what the painting is going to look like, and then they would paint over that with their paint. Under Vermeer's paintings, there was none of that.
Just improvised.
It just like seemed to like appear. Mm-hmm. It was as if he was just walking up to the painting and just painting it. And again, they said Vermeer painted with light. And obviously you don't paint with light, you paint with paint. But they said he painted with light because it was just the way his paintings came off the page. It was just so luminous. And it was almost like Caravaggio too. He's another really interesting painter to check out. Caravaggio, beautiful artwork, but a lot of his art comes out of the darkness. Caravaggio has dark, almost completely black backgrounds, and then all of a sudden you see partial or the entire image of the model of the painting, whatever the imagery might be. It seems to come out of this darkness, and that gives it this luminous quality. But Vermeer's, his whole thing was just bright, and again, it almost looked like it was like a Kodak like film slide, on one of those old carousel things. So basically, since photography was invented, people started looking at Vermeer's, or like modern photography, I should say, people started looking at Vermeer's paintings as if he was using some sort of technology, which is very interesting. So again, that brings us back to Tim Jennison. So he was one of the people who kind of started putting all these ideas together and really realizing that maybe there's something to this whole idea that Vermeer was potentially using some sort of technology to create his paintings, which again, at the time, or sorry, the problem with this, with art historians and everyone, is that it was almost perceived as cheating. That somehow he's using technology. But again, the stuff is so beautiful. So Christian's just pulling up a picture. This is actually the music lesson
for you guys too.
Yeah, he's gonna put this on there, which is awesome. So this is the music lesson that Vermeer actually painted himself, and that's the one that Tim recreated, which is super cool. And we have a shot that we'll show you of the real Vermeer versus Tim's Vermeer. I got one that will show everybody. And again, Tim Jennison noticed all this stuff because he made his career as a video engineer. So he was involved with creating a lot of cameras and using lenses, and he was just involved with creating video. So that was the thing that really caught his eye, that there was something about Vermeer's paintings that just looked like a photographic image. And there was also certain things about these images that even pointed him more so than just the overall feel, which I'll get into later. But Tim Jennison actually came to fame by creating Lightwave, which is actually creates 3D images. And this program actually won an Emmy for his company, New Tech. So it was involved with creating 3D technologies for TV, and they got an Emmy for it, which is really cool. He went on to create something called the Video Toaster, which eventually evolved into the TriCaster, which allows people to simultaneously broadcast web and live performance, still used to this day. And again, all this stuff got patented. So that's how Tim kind of made all his money, so that he could play around and do all this stuff, because he basically leaves work for takes a leave and I'll tell you in a sec. He ends up going to Holland and stuff. Is pretty wild. But again, this is how he got all that cabbage to even do all this stuff, which is pretty cool. So like I mentioned before, he's friends with Penn Jillette, and Penn kind of found out that Tim was interested in kind of really getting to the bottom of what Vermeer was doing. So him and Penn and Teller decided to create this documentary, which is really cool. Again, called Tim's Vermeer. Check it out. Really cool, right? Again, we're just looking at that image of Tim's Vermeer versus the original, and it's ridiculous, how close it is. And again, he ended up using his Lightwave programs to map the room and do everything, and we'll get into that in a second. But basically, Tim first kind of came across this when he was reading David Hockney's work. David Hockney's a really famous British artist, and he was looking basically at some of the paintings from Vermeer's time. And even before then, a lot of old medieval paintings, they were kind of barely representations of what was really going on. It was kind of more not bad. Sorry guys, I was just testing out our technology here. Speaking of which, they were kind of crude representations, almost just slightly better than cave drawings, right? Everything was kind of out of proportion. It wasn't true representation of what people saw in most paintings. That was just kind of...
Vermeer's is the one on the left, correct?
Vermeer's is the one on the left, I think. Yeah. I think, yes.
It's pristine. Look at the difference between the wall shade and the floor. That tile.
And that,
it's
and
perfect
all
shading.
Right? And that's the thing that we'll get into, that human eye can't actually see that. Which also leads them back to thinking maybe they used lenses or some type of optics, which is really interesting. So David Hockney was part of coming up with this idea that when artists did change to making these more or less photorealistic paintings, or at least much more closer to what we were really seeing, his idea is that they were using some type of optical machine. And again, it's the mid 1600s, 17th century. It's they knew how to make lenses and mirrors. They knew how to do all this stuff. It's not it wasn't like the ancient Egyptians or even before then. It wasn't, again, the modern technology at the time, it wasn't implausible for them to be using these optical machines. So that brings us again now to this camera obscura. Like I mentioned before, it's a dark box with a small hole in one side. The image on the outside is projected on the box, like I said, upside down and backwards. And again, you can use a lens in that hole to make the object clearer. and more focused with the lens. Now, David Hockney, in a BBC documentary, actually made a giant camera obscura, like a big enough that you could walk into, and he used a live subject like on the outside of it, and he traced the live subject. So he like traced the outlines as if any painter would do a sketch underneath. So Hockney was kind of onto something, but number one, when you x-ray Vermeer's paintings, you see no sketches. And two, the biggest problem with that is that you can sketch the outer outlines of the image, no problem. But the problem is you can't match the colors properly. So again, you can the Vermeers are clear. Like when you look at a Vermeer, there's no way that that's not the perfect representation of the color in that room, right? Like just the proportions of color and everything. When you look at it, it looks like a photograph, and we'll get to why. But there must have been some way that Vermeer and these other painters were actually using a machine to recreate the color. Now, the biggest problem again with painting on a projection is that, so like imagine, even if you just have like a digital projector like in your classroom, like we used to have in class, and you're projecting an image, when you go in front of it, if you have a picture, or if you have like a sheet of paper that's the exact same color that's on that projection, when you put that color, imagine it's wet paint, when you put that color against the other color, it becomes really dark, right? Like it just looks really weird, right? The only color that will match that projection perfectly is white, right? So you would never be able to match it perfectly. So again, Tim was just trying to figure out how could he possibly recreate the color perfectly, right? So Tim actually, like I mentioned, left his job. He moved. He went around the world to study Vermeer. And when he was in Holland, again, people kept saying Vermeer was painting with light. And what they really mean by that is that he had this verisimilitude, which means the appearance of being real, right? So up until photographs were created where it's exact, more or less the exact representation of the real world, people use this word to describe certain paintings. And like there's like, especially nowadays, there's like hyper realistic painters and stuff, and they're using I don't even know if they're using optical devices. They just might be like so perfect, and again, they're just trying to recreate something that already exists. But again, most of these artists back in the day, no one really knew how they created their art anyway. They just were there to appreciate it. They didn't really care, however the painting was actually created. Anyway, basically Tim was trying to figure out, again, like I mentioned, how they could match the color so perfectly, and it must have been by some mechanical means. Tim more or less he was kind of sitting in his bath one night, and it's funny, everything kind of comes to people in their bath. That's like that whole eureka thing. I'm pretty sure, was that Pythagoras who said eureka?
I don't know.
Or yeah, there was like a famous Greek mathematician or scientist or whatever, they were philosopher back in the day.
Scholar Archimedes,
which is the name of Merlin's owl in like the King Arthur stories. No, which is super cool because Archimedes is smart, right? Anyway, so Archimedes is the one who says eureka. When you say eureka, I've got it. He was in his bathtub trying to figure out the Pythagorean theorem or something. Not the Pythagorean theorem because that was Pythagoras, but some shit like that. And it came to him when he was like in the bath, and this is like a Greek bath, so it's like a bunch of boys and they're chilling and they're probably chatting. It's not just him by himself, but it happened in a bath, and he was running through the street naked yelling eureka. Anyway, so same thing happened with Tim. He imagined, how could Vermeer have done this somehow?
It's not 20, it's 30 minutes.
Oh, nice. We got a different camera almost every week this time, and Christian's just making sure it doesn't freaking click out on us. The last one was 20 minutes. Now it's half an hour. So we got a little time.
We're good, man.
But again, so Tim was kind of sitting in his bath, imagining, how Vermeer might have done it. And he imagined this whole, it's really cool when you see it in the documentary, he imagined this whole kind of setup all in his head. And he kind of thought, what if Vermeer took the camera obscura and tilted it on its side, right? And then now you have an image being projected, in the small shoebox of a camera obscura with a small lens. You have the image projected there, and then when you turn the box on its side, the image is now upside down. And what he imagined is you bring a small little round mirror in at a 45-degree angle. And then if you look from the top, you can see, and if no one's watching or if you're just listening to this, it's a little bit difficult to understand, but if you're watching on YouTube, you can see when you look straight down at a 45-degree angle, you can see the reflection of the image that you're trying to recreate, and it's now reinverted. It's not upside down anymore. And basically, at certain points, you can see the reflection of this image in this small mirror, and you can see the canvas, the blank canvas underneath at a 45-degree angle right underneath. And you can basically imagine, as you're painting, all you have to do is match the color that you're seeing on that mirror until it almost is like, it's actually an objective process. So you just match the color until the edge of the mirror kind of disappears. So any artist can do this. Actually, in the documentary, Tim and another gentleman actually paint a painting together. Like, it doesn't even matter who's doing the brushstrokes, because again, it's an objective process. So essentially, you're turning yourself into a camera, right? You like we talked about before, the camera, even the camera that we're using, light is going through, it's bouncing off me and it's going through the lens and refracting and focusing through the lens, and it's being, on this camera is a mirrorless camera, but on most other cameras with film, at least even before digital, that light image was then projected on the film, and then the film had a chemical in it that was light sensitive, and then it would change to the information that's coming through the lens. Basically, with you're now turning your human eye into that monitor, and then you are now just mixing the paint and creating that chemical reaction on the canvas yourself. Instead of in a millisecond, it's happening over hours and hours. But because you're using lenses and mirrors, just like a camera would. Again, this camera is called mirrorless because it doesn't have a mirror in it. But any other camera would have a lens onto a mirror, right? Just like this whole setup with the camera obscura and having the mirror inside is really, really very interesting, because this is so much like, when was the first camera invented? Like actual, because they were doing those old school ones where you had to put the hood over and right? And it's funny because I read this once that all those old people look serious in those paintings, like from Victorian era. They're all serious because the camera's exposure time was so long that if you moved, it would make it blurry. So you had to keep still as you possibly could for 10 seconds. And the easiest way to stay still is just keep a straight face, right?
Right. So George Eastman was the first one to come up with the Kodak camera. So
no shit.
First offered for sale in 1888.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's the most modern camera, 1888. So we're talking still at least about 250 years before even the most modern or more or less modern Kodak cameras was invented, which is super, super cool. So with all this knowledge, Tim was thinking, the most powerful way to demonstrate this theory would be to recreate the Vermeer exactly. So he picked the music lesson, which is the image that we've been looking at throughout the podcast, because when you look at the image, you can tell all those little pieces of the room can be recreated separately. You can get the carpet, you can get the viola da gamba, which is the big cello looking thing. You can build the room, you can build that harpsichord thing, right? You can get two people to come in and dress up. So versus some of the other paintings were very specific, and there's not even a real main subject in this painting, which is really cool. You're just kind of looking at the scene. It's not like you're looking at a woman sitting in a room and then everything else is background noise. This is like
it's a music lesson.
100%. Like you're totally seeing that, but then it's also like you get to see the rest of the room, and it's tremendous because it's like a candid shot, right? And it's like, oh, so cool. And again, the light, like we're looking at representations of representations on a screen, a digital screen, and it's still like beautiful to look at. Like it's hard to imagine.
1662, like,
right?
What?
Hard to imagine that someone put this together. And again, back in the day, like everything was from scratch. Like they even had to mix the paint themselves.
Right. Like I was just thinking, like, how would they get the oils and that back then to create the color?
Right.
Color.
That was like back with like, that was like merchant stuff. Like back in the day when they were like creating the Silk Road and stuff, like you would get like the special pigment came from India, the red or something. And then this special black came from, Iceland, who knows, like, cause it came from volcanic, like, crazy stuff like that. But like so much so that people would keep this stuff guarded. Like you wouldn't tell what your formulas were and stuff, and you wouldn't tell how you did this, right? So that's why it still remains a mystery. Again, there's no documentation for Vermeer's even education as an artist, which is super, super weird. And again, the general consensus more or less for Vermeer, like this whole strategy, is that Vermeer saw the camera obscura and then was inspired by it. So this is kind of what your general art scholar is going to tell you, which, because they just, it's hard for them to go back. It's almost like that whole thing with Egyptian scholars, and they don't ever want to challenge like how old the pyramids are or what they're made for, even though there's all this other evidence saying that they might have been doing something, they might have been built way before everyone's saying. But all the Egyptian Egyptologists are like, we're not going back on any of this stuff. We've been telling everyone that this is what it's been since the 1800s. We're not going back on it. What if it's falsified? What about all the other disciplines in science and stuff that are constantly like physics and chemistry, where they're like, we screwed up, or this was we were limited by the technology that we had, and now we got a better microscope and we can see this now. So we fucked up, and now this is the new info. No one's like burning bridges. But again, it's strange, and art historians are the same thing, because it's just so been around for so hundreds of years, and it's embedded in people's minds, and it's in textbooks, and it's this and that, and this. It's a strange kind of old school way of thinking, which thankfully is starting to die out. I think a lot of new scholars have a little bit more of an open mind to new stuff. Anyway, but like I mentioned, that Vermeer potentially could have been inside one of these giant camera obscuras, but then using this little mirror object inside, instead of trying to trace it on the wall like David Hockney was doing, he was using this camera inside the camera obscura, which is really interesting. Actually, Vermeer's first painting ever, called The Girl with the Red Hat, or the earliest Vermeer that they found, is called The Girl with the Red Hat, and it, after they x-rayed it, is painted over another painting. So they think that this was probably Vermeer's like first try, because his dad was an art dealer, right? So he had artwork, and he just went over it just to see if it would work. And it's funny when you look at the painting, that's one of those paintings that you can start to see that there was some kind of optical device used, because there's like parts of it that would only look like that if they were viewed through a lens. Yeah, Lady in the Red Hat, Vermeer. Christian's just looking up for us. So many of Vermeer's paintings were probably painted all in the same room by the way they look. So we're actually looking at the Lady with the Red Hat right here. So again, amazing use of light. This is his first one, but you can almost tell in the background almost looks rushed. Like it looks like he didn't really pay a lot of attention to the background. But so we'll even put this one up in the video as well. But if you look on the foreground, if you guys are watching on YouTube, if you look in the foreground, see there's a chair she's sitting on. The little lion head is like fuzzy in the foreground, but in the background it's clear, and like the human eye adjusts to what it looks at, right? So if Vermeer was just painting this subject by looking at her, he wouldn't he wouldn't paint one of those things like kind of fuzzy, because that's just not how the human eye works. So super interesting. But again, this is the first one which he painted over another painting, which is super cool. But basically, a gentleman named Philip Stedman wrote this book called Vermeer's Camera, and he figured out that all the paintings were painted in this one room, and that's the room that Tim Jennison went on to build. You can actually do like a calculation and figure out where the lens would be, like how far away from everything, and the projection that would be on the wall, like in the camera obscura. This gentleman, Philip Stedman, did the calculation and figured out all of Vermeer's paintings are the exact same size, i.e. he was using the same device every time somehow, which is super cool. So again, when Tim was planning on building the room, he was going to build it exactly to specification, and then he was only going to use the technology and materials that Vermeer had at the time. So he was only going to use natural light. He was going to make his own paint. So that's like grinding pigment and adding oil and doing this whole thing. And then he was going to create his own lenses, because modern lenses are actually too good. So the modern lenses are so good that they'd probably be too crisp. And so he had to literally pour glass, melt it, grind it down with different abrasives. Like he did it all himself, hours and hours of work, which is amazing. During this process, he actually visited Delft in the Netherlands, which is where Vermeer is from. He learned to read Dutch. He studied the architecture and light in the town. He learned how to make his own paint there. He had a potter create like the exact same white jug that's in the painting. And he measured out all the furniture, the chairs, the virginal, which is the harpsichord looking thing. Like he measured that all out in the Netherlands, because again, unfortunately, you can't just buy all this stuff. So he had to actually build it all. So again, this brings us back to our buddy Philip Stedman. So I mentioned him before. He's the author of Vermeer's Camera. So he's one of the first people after David Hockney's work to actually propose that Vermeer used a camera obscura to do all this stuff, right? Like I said, he figured out that they're all the same size. And when the book came out, art historians, this is according to Philip Stedman, art historians were deeply anguished by the book. They were just like, we don't even know what to say. You're challenging hundreds of years of this person. And again, Vermeer was always looked at, because they didn't know how he did it and they didn't know where he was taught, as like a savant. Again, like I mentioned, he was like a Mozart. Like this guy comes out of seemingly nowhere. No one taught him anything, and he was this unfathomable genius, right? And so again, all art historians were freaking out. They're like, what do we even say here? But all the artists were like, this is a new tool. Like the artist community were like, yeah, all right, he's using a new tool. Like, why is this way cheating versus the traditional way of using geometry and sectioning a canvas out, in this special, using mathematics? How is that any different? And using geometry, how is that any different than using this tool, right? But again, it's the art historians want to believe that painters can do these miraculous things, which some of them can, and many artists over hundreds of years and thousands of years now have created beautiful pieces of art by just going up to the canvas and painting it, but nothing that looked quite like this, right? So some stuff, although you might be a master painter, some stuff is much harder than others, again, and that's capturing life the way not only your human eye would see it, but actually how a lens would see it, which the lens actually focuses the light better than our human eye could ever see it. And we see, that's why photography is amazing, because we can see aspects of our reality that we can't even normally see. And that's just normal photography, let alone X-ray and UV photography and all those other spectrums. So fascinating. Anyway, again, this all brings us back to the fact that there's no description that Vermeer did this at all. There's no evidence, there's no documentation, there's no letters written, even like fake letters. Someone just, hey, mind if, you know, you're writing a letter to like the Italian Rouge mirror company, and you're like, hey, yeah, can I get one of those mirrors for my wife? You know what I mean? Like that wouldn't even exist, because again, back in the day, people kept this stuff so quiet. No one was telling people how they did all this stuff. Nowadays, it's all about teaching people how to do things. Back in the day, it was people swore oaths. Again, one of the famous master Dutch painters, Van Eyck, he never even wrote down the formulas for his paint because he didn't want people to find them. Like, that's how hardcore these dudes were. Because again, each painter made their own paint, so their colors were special. Actually, Van Gogh Oil Paints is a company you can buy to this day, right? Which may or may not actually be based on Van Gogh's formulas. But again, it's still the idea that an artist used to actually create everything. They probably even put the canvas on the wood panel themselves. Like, they just did every little thing, right? Which is pretty cool. So Tim and Philip actually painted this white jug. They took the white jug that the potter made, which is in the music box, and the music lesson, and they took the jug and they just painted themselves to prove that, again, it doesn't matter, that it doesn't even have to be one person painting. It can be two people. It's an objective process, right? So it's pretty cool. So all said and done, Tim used his 3D mapping program, like I mentioned, to actually map out the room and rebuild it. He taught himself how to, like, put the windows together. He taught himself how to make little brass pieces. He used all this woodworking, and he's not a carpenter. He's not a brass maker. He's not a blacksmith. He's not a glazier, but he's a technologist, and he used what he knew to figure this stuff out. So again, he used his light wave technology to create the 3D map of the room. And he did everything. He actually had a lathe, to make legs for the tables and chairs and stuff. And one of the table legs was so big that it didn't fit in the lathe. So he actually cut the lathe in half to make it bigger. And he's like, usually you don't, cut a precision instrument in half, but he's like, tools were meant to be messed with. So really interesting. And he ended up getting it done. Again, the guy he's more or less like one of those genius guys, and he's kind of like eccentric, and he does a lot of stuff where you're like, man, that seems like the hard way, but he's like, this is what I know. And he more or less is doing all on his own. There's a couple guys that came in, like masons and stuff, that he couldn't do, and electricians, but more or less he's literally doing all this stuff himself. He's actually, in the movie, he's quoted as saying, can I just say for the record, this is the hardest thing I've ever done, and I haven't even started painting yet. This better fucking work. That's what Tim said. So basically, with Philip Stedman and Vermeer's camera and David Hockney's ideas about the camera obscura put together, plus Tim's hypothesis about using the little mirror, they're pretty sure that they figured out Vermeer's technology. So again, the idea that people wouldn't have used a type of optical technology is kind of childish, according to David Hockney. He thinks, Italians and the art intelligentsia at the time, they wouldn't have looked at this as, again, they wouldn't have looked at it as cheating. They would still, and just they're there to appreciate the art. They don't care how it's made. If the thing's beautiful, the thing's beautiful. Who cares? Again, that's the thing with visual art. It could be a sculpture, it could be a painting on a canvas. It could be so many different things, and it's still, if it makes you feel something, then it's good art, right? So who's to say what's what? And again, we're looking back and thinking, oh, there's no way he would have done this. But again, who's to say? And nowadays we look, art and technology rarely meet, right? We don't look at them as two different things. If anything, we look at it as either more technology, and if it's not more technology, then it's art. That's basically how, and then we don't look at them together, which is pretty wild. But back then, artists and scientists, like, look at Leonardo da Vinci, they were the same person, right? Like, if you were able to even do art, you were probably able to be free to start learning and being educated and all this other stuff, where a lot of other people at the time, they weren't even able to. So it wasn't like there was all these artists and then all these engineers running around. If you were able to do one, you were able to do the other, right? Because if not, you were probably working in the fields or working as like you were like a serf or like some weird like hierarchical like subject like of the king at the time, right? So not everyone was able to do this, but the people who were explored kind of every aspect. Again, Leonardo da Vinci designed a tank, and he designed like a primitive helicopter. Like he was like an engineer, and then he also painted the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper and like all this other cool stuff too. And he was like a crazy, like he would like dig bodies up and study their anatomy and stuff. Like just again, this was to be a better painter and then to be a better scientist. Like they just went hand in hand. So, but this process was essentially photography. And again, we'll never find the documents about this, but the only thing we can kind of look at are these paintings. And paintings are forms of documents. You know, people with trained eye can look at a painting and gain as much information from it as you would a document, right? So we're gaining a lot of information by looking at these paintings. And for instance, a lot of the information that's again leading us back to thinking that this is an optical device is that there's a lot of optical kind of mishaps almost, or aberrations, if you will, that are noticeable in Vermeer's painting. So again, the girl with the red hat, like we mentioned, has that fuzzy part of the chair that looks like it's out of focus. On some of his other paintings, you can see kind of little dots of light, which would only kind of come out of, or pointia they're called, and that would only come out of a bad lens. So again, like Tim was saying, the lenses back in the day weren't always perfect, and you would get these little kind of like bubbles of light, which is just the light kind of reflecting through an imperfection in the lens. But Vermeer, in some of Vermeer's paintings, he was painting those little imperfections. And then on one of his other paintings, you can kind of see like a rainbow outline on one of the subjects, which again only happens, and that's called chromatic aberration. That only happens when you look through a lens. The human eye would never see that. And again, the biggest thing with Vermeer's paintings is that the paintings represent absolute brightness. So that's the problem. The human eye can't see absolute brightness. Again, that means literally from a scale of like 0 to 100, you can see every single incremental change in the brightness. Our human eye is really good at when two objects of different shade are right beside each other. We can do a really good job at saying one is darker than the other. But once those objects are brought farther apart, our human eye, just the way it works in our retina, we can only focus on a certain part, and we can't really tell the difference once those are far apart. But in Vermeer's paintings, it showed like this perfect drop off of light, or this fall off of light. When you look at it in the music lesson, this fall off from the window to the other end of the room is just perfectly represented, but the human eye would never be able to see that. The human brain actually can't handle all the info that your eye is actually seeing. So your retinal cells actually compress the info going into the optical nerve. And again, you know, like Christian and I were talking about the other day, the human brain is basically meant to inhibit a lot of processes, especially your senses, because you can't handle all the sensory input at once. And basically, because your retina does this compression of information, it's good for your brain to be able to make sense of our world, but it's terrible. It's terrible for our brain to actually see what the world is actually looks like. So even there, in the smallest way, we've mentioned this on the podcast before, what our eye sees and what our senses see is not true reality. Right. But we put all this stock into it because that's just what we see, and we've never been shown anything else. And like, I remember even sitting in my physiology classes learning about the eye and saying, like, even just the simple fact that what we're seeing is upside down, like, our brain is the thing that's flipping it. Excuse me. There's no mechanical process that's flipping the image. Our brain is the one that's doing it. So who knows how many small small mistakes have been made along the way. And again, who's to say the red that you're seeing is the red that I'm seeing, and all that stuff, right? It all goes back to, there is a mechanical interface between us and reality, and that's our eyeball. Like when we're looking anyway, the mechanical interface is us and our eyeball. And we know through physiology that mechanical device isn't perfect. Lenses are much more perfect. Cameras do a much better job at actually looking at reality and catching in that light and seeing it. And then we're looking at that picture with this eye. But again, right? Like it's, our human eye has an imperfection. It helps us get all this information, but again, not perfect at seeing absolute brightness. But Vermeer's paintings show that, which again is one more check in the box as far as saying maybe he used some type of optical device, which is fascinating. So in the documentary, Tim actually wanted to go see the original music lesson, because obviously all the ones that he was seeing were just prints or recreations. And actually the Queen of England owns the actual original music lessons, and it's in Buckingham Palace. So he's an American dude, Penn and Teller are American dudes. They're going in there like, hey, can we go see the painting? And they got denied. Yeah. So in the documentary, they do this big tirade on the Queen. They don't air it, but they film this whole thing. And I guess the information probably got back somehow. Cause they're probably watching these guys film this stuff, and they're like, what are you guys doing? And they knew that, and so anyway, the day before Tim had to leave England, the Queen changed her mind and was like, hey, you can see it. So, but you have to be alone and no cameras. So he went in there half an hour and he saw it just with his own eye. And he had like his little like magnifying glasses. But he said the reproductions don't do it justice. He says, seeing it in person, it was so different than any of the prints. He said there was an overall bluish hue to it, which again could have been from the lens. But just again, the attention to detail, he said it must have taken him months and months to figure this out, which must have been like, again, to lay your eyes on this must have been so cool. So Tim at one point goes back and he's inside his camera obscura, and he's got the room all set up, it's all ready to go. And he's looking at the detail on the virginal, that little harpsichord thing, and it's this really intricate interlocking seahorse pattern. And he's looking at the reflection, and it's fuzzy. And he's like, "Oh man!" He thinks the experiment's failed. He's like, "Oh no, what am I gonna do?" And for whatever reason, he came and he put a mirror in front of the wall. So now the projection was onto this mirror. And instead of a big wide projection on the wall, it was this small little dot on the mirror that was like 10 times brighter and like perfectly clear. And then he brought in a concave mirror, like a shaving mirror. He brought that in, and then it focused the light, and then it was so bright that he didn't have to be in the dark room anymore. So he got rid of the room, got rid of the camera obscura box, and the only thing left of that was just the lens and then this concave mirror. And then he used his small little lens on a 45 degree to look at the concave mirror. And then he could do all the intricate parts of that and everything, even the carpet. He could do all the little knots in the carpet. Tremendous. So Tim used mannequins to paint the clothes, but he needed models for the faces and hands. So he actually used real people, and obviously it takes a while, so he had to keep them still. So he like set up like clamps and stuff that they could like rest their head on. So like they didn't actually have to be like holding their head up the whole time. And his daughter like sat in as like the girl in the painting and stuff. And it's really, really cool. Again, you'll see in the painting, if you're watching on YouTube, that there's a reflection of the girl in the painting. So you don't actually see her face, but you see a reflection of it in a mirror that's actually in the painting itself, which is super, super cool. And again, like imagine just painting this from looking at the scene. So cool. Tim actually noticed when painting that intricate pattern, that intricate seahorse pattern, that because of the concave mirror, it was slightly curved. Like, obviously it's a straight line, you can see, but when you look really closely, because when Tim was painting it, he noticed that there was this small little smile, he called it. And he was like, oh, that must just be from the mirror. Like, I better be careful or I'm going to paint this thing on an angle. And then he picked up the print that he was working from of the original, and he looked at it on an angle, and you can see the virginal on the detail that Vermeer himself painted. It was kind of on this little curve. And again, it's just all these things adding up, just keep adding up in favor of this must have been what Vermeer did. Because how else would there be? You're supposed to be painting a straight line? Why on earth would you kind of paint it on a little curve, which is super, super cool. And that's, when we said paintings or documents, that's what we mean. You can look at that and go, wow, there's no other way that he would have made that mistake unless he was using this technology. It took Tim 130 days to paint the painting from blank canvas to finished. Overall, it took him 1,825 days if you count all the... Yeah.
That's a lot.
Right? If you count all the work into it, going to Holland, building the thing.
It's about 3 years. Right?
It took him so long. And Philip Stedman, the author of Vermeer's camera, said it was better than Vermeer when he got a chance to look at it. Hockney and Stedman looked at it and they were blown away. So, what we kind of are left to ask ourselves is Tim an artist or is Tim an inventor? And the problem isn't which is he. The problem is that we have this distinction at all. The fact that you either have to be one or the other. And who's to say that there's engineers out there that are just as much an artist, and then there's artists out there that are creating technologies and ways to recreate our reality and their reality that are just as intricate and technologically advanced as something that an engineer would be doing. It's fascinating. So like we said, Vermeer's no longer an unfathomable genius, but more a fathomable one. We kind of understand what he's doing. It's not to say that this is easy. It's not to say that anyone can do it. In fact, I'm actually trying to do it myself. We'll put pictures on the Patreon if anyone wants to see how far I'm doing, because I'm not going to just show anyone.
Good. Yeah, so far
Christian's seen it. Man. Yeah, thank you. I've only put about an hour into it so far, and it's fun. It's been really interesting. I'm actually trying to recreate the wedding photo of my dad's parents. So my grandpa Stan and my nana Mary got married and obviously had their wedding photo, so that it's in black and white. So I went with something black and white instead of having to do all the color. And we'll see how it turns out. Yeah. I'm excited. Tim's Vermeer, if anyone's wondering it actually now hangs in his bedroom.
Oh, no way.
Above his fireplace in his bedroom. That's so he's got basically looks like a Vermeer in his house. But anyway, if everyone enjoyed this podcast, go check it out. Go check out Tim's Vermeer. Like I said, it's from 2013, so it might be a little harder to find. But yeah, check it out. Watch it. Enjoy it as much as I did. It's super cool. And like I said, if you enjoyed the podcast, remember to hit that bell. Make sure you get all our notifications. Hit the like. Rate the podcast. Support the podcast at thepatreon.com/the Bigmark pod. We love you all. Talk to you soon. Go have some fun. Peace.